So welcome to the seminar for the Cambridge Center for Christianity Worldwide. My name is Jörg Haustein. I'm a lecturer in World Christianities at the faculty here and co-convener together with Dr. Mutaraj Swami of this seminar series. And this term we are looking at Pentecostalism and Pentecostal churches. And if you've done anything on Pentecostalism and the study of Pentecostal churches, you will have met the name Allan Anderson. You will have likely read his introduction to Pentecostalism or his other book on Pentecostal missionary history, Spreading Fires, or indeed perhaps even his newest work on Spirit-Filled World. Allan Anderson was born in Zimbabwe, or grew up in Zimbabwe and Zambia, spent the beginning of his academic career in Southern Africa, teaching at a Pentecostal theological college, doing his PhD there, but also working with Pentecostals. And then in 1995, he came to Birmingham to teach intercultural theology there, and he made Birmingham into the European Center for the study of Pentecostalism, having trained many PhD students over the years. And of course, writing a lot of the books that you may have seen. I got to meet Allan Anderson for the first time, I think about 16 years ago now, or 17 years, when we were just beginning to build up something around the study of Pentecostalism in Heidelberg. We approached him, brought him to us, and said, let's form a network together. And he was gracious enough, even though he was the heavyweight in Europe, to accept this proposal. And that led to the founding of the European Research Network on Global Pentecostalism, together with the University of Amsterdam, and then other universities joined us. And this is now a network of scholars studying Pentecostalism from various disciplinary angles at the PhD level or beyond. I think we have around 350 scholars in our network. So this is something that Allan has very much enabled us all to do. And I've always really enjoyed working with you, Allan, in the various steering group meetings and things that we've had. And perhaps one could even say you are one of the reasons I'm in the UK now. So it's a real privilege to welcome you to our seminar here and to speak to us about your new book, revisiting some things you've done in the 1990s and then went back to do and followed up with some interviews in how African religious ideas have been incorporated in Pentecostal practice, and speaking to the continuity and discontinuity debate that really was begun in anthropology in the study of West African Pentecostalism, now from a South African perspective. So I very much look forward to your talk, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jörg, for your generous introduction. And thank you, everybody who has come to listen to me. I appreciate very much being able to see some heavyweight scholars there in the I'm sure you're all heavyweight scholars, actually. Yeah, but it's good to be able to speak to you in this way. Okay, what I'm going to talk about is the whole issue of the continuity debate in African Pentecostalism. That's the subtitle of the paper. At the beginning of the 21st century, South Africa had perhaps the world's most unequal economy, which could only be compared with Brazil. And the poorest 20% of the population had 3% of the income. The richest 20% have 42% of the income. This has got much to do with the racially divided structures of the economy, which is still struggling to undo generations of damage, and the unfair distribution of wealth. Inequality is also affected by the divide between rural and urban and gender divisions. The most vulnerable groups in society are the large numbers of unemployed, the farm workers, female domestic servants, and female-headed households. Many of these groups are found in townships like Soshanguve, which is the main place of my research. As a continuing result of apartheid, South Africa has deeply entrenched divisions in society, both racially and ethnically. Its largely urban people are overwhelmingly dependent on employment and wages. To exacerbate this, the pandemic of HIV/AIDS infected over 6 million of its most productive younger adults In 2013, the highest number of HIV infections on the continent. And this had, of course, a crippling effect on the nation's economy. And like many other nations, the COVID pandemic has exacerbated the situation even more. These calamities characterize the situation in which most Black South Africans in overcrowded townships like Soshanguve find themselves. But in all this injustice, inequality, and poverty, Christianity flourishes. Pentecostalism is one of the most vigorous and fastest growing religious movements in South Africa, as in the rest of the sub-Sahara. Although there are always challenges with statistics on Pentecostalism, they indicate a worldwide trend of rapid expansion, and South Africa is no exception. A large proportion of all South African Christians belong to Pentecostal or Pentecostal-like independent churches, like the Zionist and Apostolic independent churches, or the more recent so-called new prophetic churches. One estimate in 2002 put the total numbers of Zionist, Apostolic, and Pentecostal charismatic church members at over 14 million, which was almost 33% of the total population. And this figure was very similar to the statistics I'd analyzed 10 years before that. But this general figure hides a world of difference. Pentecostalism has been successful in Africa, I think, because of its emphasis on spiritual experience and its remarkable ability to adapt to religious and cultural backgrounds. But the simple statistics of church affiliation do not reveal the extent to which Christianity is affected by and affects older forms of so-called traditional religions that undergird African societies. I consider a principal reason for its popularity is that Pentecostalism, through its experience of the Spirit, often unconsciously taps into deep-seated religious and cultural beliefs and draws from these sources in continuity with them, while simultaneously confronting them in discontinuity, using a biblical rationale for its beliefs and practices. This is the subject of my book, The Spirit-Filled World, and I will summarize this in this paper. This is not a new idea, at least not in the social sciences. Almost 20 years ago, Joel Robbins remarked that his discipline tends to be a science of continuity. Anthropologists use foundational arguments about the inability of people to view the world except through their received categories. Therefore, anthropologists who study religion see the introduction of new religions, like Pentecostalism, as taking on the ideas and characteristics of the old religion. Robbins argues that to understand global Pentecostalism properly, anthropologists need as robust a science of discontinuity as one of continuity. He shows how Pentecostalism has two paradoxes that make it both and at the same time continuous and discontinuous with the host culture. The first paradox is, and I quote, "In attacking local cultures, Pentecostalism tends to accept their ontologies, including their ontologies of spirits and witches and other occult powers, and to take the spiritual beings these ontologies posit as paramount among the forces it struggles against," unquote. The second paradox refers to the characteristics that make Pentecostalism distinctive in Christianity. The practices of spiritual gifts like healing, exorcism, prophecy, and speaking in tongues or glossolalia, practices found in Pentecostalism throughout the world. Anthropologists have also tended to observe the continuity of these practices with pre-Christian religions or their similarities without giving attention to their widespread use in many different cultural settings throughout the world. In other words, their differences with local religions. The theme of continuity has also dominated theological and religious studies with regard to Pentecostalism. The architect of Pentecostal studies, arguably Walter Hollenweger, wrote that Pentecostalism is based on its Black roots, as he put it, mediated through its African-American founders at Azusa Street, Los Angeles. and that these aspects of African religion cause it to flourish in similar cultures where orality and what he called a narrative theology and witness are the dominant features. Harvey Cox takes this a step further in his Fire from Heaven, where he states that the rapid spread of Pentecostalism is because of, quote, its heady and spontaneous spirituality, which he calls primal spirituality. Cox suggests that for any religion to grow, it must include two underlying factors. One, to be able to include and transform at least certain elements of pre-existing religions, which still retain a strong grip on the cultural subconscious. And two, and I'm quoting him here, to also equip people to live in rapidly changing societies. He sees these two key ingredients in Pentecostalism, which helps, he says, people recover vital elements in their culture that are threatened by modernization. So Harvey Cox is referring to pre-existing religions with a strong grip on the cultural subconscious is a focus on continuity. Similarly, many have written on African Pentecostalism, and African independent churches have attributed their success to their continuation of what is termed an enchanted worldview that retains ideas from pre-Christian African religions. As Swedish Lutheran missionary Bishop Bent Zunkler famously put it, creating a bridge back to the past. In other words, continuity. Zunkler later almost retracted this view. Pentecostals themselves point out that they confront rather than accommodate the spirit world. So they would almost invariably point to a radical discontinuity. These two contrasting views of insiders and outsiders seemingly can never be reconciled. But there are signs of change. The Nigerian Pentecostal scholar Nimi Ariboko describes the ability of Nigerian Pentecostals to be, he puts, simultaneously inside and outside African traditional religions, representing, he says, both continuity and rupture in the same Nigerian religious landscape. This inside-outside tension, though not developed in an explicit way, remains an underlying theme of his significant work. The Danish anthropologist Martin Lindhardt also notes that the most fruitful work results from a non-dualistic approach to African Pentecostalism by exploring, he says, the complex ways in which rupture and continuity, modernity and tradition, or the global and the local, are combined in the production of cultural forms. This seeming contradiction is explored in my book, offering some empirical data to support it. The concept of the spirit occupies an important place in charismatic Christianity in Africa. At the same time, this becomes more meaningful when placed in the context of the spirit world that permeates most aspects of African life. My book is primarily about South Africa, where, like the rest of Africa, Pentecostalism has become one of the most prominent forms of Christianity. It permeates every historic denomination and independent church. It has not only contributed to the reshaping of the nature of Christianity, but has also left an indelible mark on popular religion and culture throughout the sub-Sahara. The ordinary adherents of Pentecostalism and the related independent churches are usually on the cutting edge of encounters with a dynamic popular religion that has existed for generations and still permeates African societies, albeit in interaction with a constantly changing context with globalizing tendencies. Both in its similarities and in its differences with local beliefs and rituals, Pentecostalism has succeeded in remarkable ways to integrate these. My book is all about that integration. The African experiences discussed there have parallels in places where a holistic spiritual universe is central to human experience and beliefs. As Adam Ashforth, who's another anthropologist, points out, quote, for most humans, the ultimate source of security is to be found in relations with spiritual powers of various sorts. He says, Most humans also live in a world with a lively appreciation of invisible agencies. My aim in my research was to analyze important ideas of popular Pentecostalism in relation to the pervasive spiritual world. This world of ancestors, evil spirits, witch familiars, and demonic forces is believed to be responsible for all manners of events, including witchcraft, misfortune, illness, poverty, and a host of other social, economic, and political problems, bringing spiritual insecurity. These beliefs are in continuity with the past, but in its encounter with this spirit world, Pentecostalism offers radical, discontinuous solutions to all these problems through its emphasis on the power of the Spirit and the exercise of spiritual gifts. But in doing this, Pentecostal actually preserves that pervasive spirit world. Are Pentecostals otherworldly and unconcerned with the larger structural, social, and political issues that are behind continental misfortunes? This question is important because the African spiritual world in popular religious speak is related to the prevalence of poverty, misfortune, and disease throughout this continent. In this popular understanding, these are not primarily social or physical problems, but behind them is the ontological world of spirits, witchcraft, and manipulating evil forces that need to be encountered and dealt with. So that's the theory behind what I'm going to speak about now. The first phase of this research was carried out from 1990 to 1995 in the township of Soshanguve, which is a dormitory suburb of Pretoria, which is now the metropolitan region of Tshwane, the city of Tshwane. An extensive survey of 1,633 households was conducted to determine the demographic breakdown of the people living in the township, particularly with regard to their religious beliefs, but other questions were asked as well in that survey. This was the end of the apartheid era, a time of great transition following the unbanning of national political parties, the scrapping of discriminatory legislation, and the release of political prisoners, including Mandela in February 1990. This led to the first democratic elections in April 1994 and the beginning of the African Congress government, which is still in power today. The question of religious affiliation was not asked in the 2011 South African census, the last one we have information from, but in 2001, some 80% of South Africans declared themselves Christian. Furthermore, the Zionist, Apostolic, and the Pentecostal charismatic churches accounted for over half of the Christian population and a third of the total population. Soshanguve today is the result of the urban legacy, or what has been called the open scars of apartheid, when residential areas were determined by race and dormitory townships were built on the peripheral areas of cities in an attempt to contain the growing urban Black population around the cities where only whites could reside. It lies about 20 miles northwest of Pretoria. It's part of the greater metropolitan region, as I mentioned, the city of Tshwane, in the northern part of the province of Gauteng. Gauteng is by far the most densely populated province in South Africa, and it is South Africa's commercial and industrial heartland, including the areas around Johannesburg and Pretoria, and has a population of over 13 million, conservatively estimated. Soshanguve is in one of the top three fastest growing cities in South Africa since 2001. In 2015, it was estimated that 64% of South Africa's population lived in cities, which makes it one of the most urbanized parts of Africa. According to the 2011 census, Soshanguve was the largest township in this region, with, at that time, just over 400,000 residents, over 99% who are Black African. Since then, the population has grown enormously, so it was estimated that over 750,000 by 2015. As the most densely populated area in the region, and with rising urbanization, Soshanguve has also suffered from a rapid increase in informal settlements, enormous shanty towns that proliferate around the formal housing areas without proper sanitary facilities. In spite of some positive developments, Soshanguve remains an area where underprivileged and poor people are the vast majority. Some of the formal housing areas in the area are well maintained, but the well over 120 informal shanty towns around Tshwane remain squalid and lack the most basic amenities. The inhabitants of Soshanguve could easily be described as Liz McGregor portrayed a more famous urban black sprawl, Soweto, which is some 60 miles to the south. Soweto, she said, Sowetans are a religious bunch. On a Sunday morning, the entire population seems to be on its way to church. This is a religious community, and church is as much a social as a spiritual meeting place. So most people in urban communities like Soweto and Soshanguve belong to a church. And if they don't attend every week, at least they do occasionally. Soshanguve, like all urban areas in South Africa, is pluralistic. In my 1990s survey, only 7% of respondents had no church. 43% belonged to African independent churches, of which 31% of that number were Zionist and Apostolics. 38% were members of Protestant, Anglican, and Roman Catholic churches. The largest single church in Soshanguve and now in the whole country is the Zion Christian Church, which in the 1990s was 10% of the population. And by 2001, in the census, it was 11% of the country's population. The various Zionist and Apostolic churches have historical and theological affinities to Pentecostalism, but usually with a significantly different worship and liturgy and a different attitude to some pre-Christian religious practices. The Apostolic Faith Mission and the Assemblies of God were the largest of the more conventional Pentecostal churches in Soshanguve in the 1990s. They were both founded by European and American missionaries near the beginning of the 20th century. But in the 2000s, in Soshanguve, the largest congregation was the Praise Tabernacle Church, led by Victor Mkhotwa. And I did much of my focus group interviews in 2016 in that congregation because of my personal connections there. During the first phase of the research, we asked questions regarding pre-Christian religious practices and noticed a significant difference between answers to these questions given by those in Pentecostal and charismatic churches and those in other churches, including Zionist and Apostolic churches. We asked three questions. One, whether they participated in ritual offerings to ancestors. Two, whether they practiced other forms of ancestor commemoration. And three, whether they consulted healers or diviners. Almost all the Pentecostals surveyed said that they were opposed to ancestor rituals and did not consult healers or diviners. This was confirmed by the focus groups we held in 2016. The data suggested that Pentecostals were more forthright than the members of other churches were in their rejection of those practices which they saw as incompatible with Christianity. This was the only grouping of churches in South Africa that almost totally rejected these religious practices, displaying a radical discontinuity. Pentecostals were quite sure that a person who is saved does not do these things, which represents the old life out of which everything has become new. So to say a bit more about the project itself, I worked as a theology teacher in Soshanguve over a period of 17 years altogether. My family lived in the area in the 7 years before we moved to the UK. And also, I worked as a part-time researcher at the University of South Africa in those last 7 years. The results of the first phase of the research, involving a massive survey of 1,633 households, were tabulated and recorded in earlier publications. During the second phase of the research, we conducted over 300 interviews in Soshanguve and the surrounding areas with selected participants from different churches. We held structured face-to-face interviews with people whose stories were recorded, translated, and later transcribed. This was all part of a long process of deductive research in which the many different strands of information were subjected to an analytical process to attempt to find themes and discern patterns of belief and behavior. The third phase began when I returned to these stories in 2014 after a conversation I had with the late David Martin, but that's another story. I'll maybe have time for that later. My return trip to Soshanguve in July and August 2016 was to gather more stories and complete and update the research. This time I interviewed and recorded 11 focus groups in various locations in Soshanguve to find out whether my earlier findings were still relevant and appropriate. If they were, the focus groups, consisting mostly of Pentecostals, would add further light to my findings from 2 decades earlier. This time, however, I concentrated solely on their views on the spirit world and its effect on their lives. The group recordings averaged just over an hour each, and there were 50 women and 46 men altogether in these groups. Many of them were young people who would not have been born or may not, or would have been very young at the time of the earlier research. In these groups, I asked the same questions asked in the earlier interviews, but I narrowed them to those relevant to my focus, relating to experiences with misfortune, ancestors, witchcraft, and the spirit world. In the reproduction of the stories, I hope to demonstrate why Pentecostal forms of Christianity resonate with these experiences and offer solutions to the challenges inherent there. I concentrated on 3 main aspects of the spirit world which African Christians encounter most frequently. The first is the world of ancestors, the guardians and protectors of African societies, whose greatest wish is to be remembered. The second is the fearful world of witchcraft with curses, evil spirits, nature spirits, and hobgoblins, particularly one known as Kokolo, for which people need constant protection. The third is the realm of misfortune, bad luck, and illness, often also believed to be caused by witchcraft and for which people seek remedies and relief. There appear to be at least 3 different kinds of Christian responses to the African spirit world, sometimes, but not always, corresponding to different types of churches. These responses may be likened to a spectrum with total discontinuity on one side and total continuity on the other, with everything else in between. And in reality, there are unlikely to be any positions on either extreme end of the spectrum. Okay, I think the main thing is, the first one is indifference, which is simply put, there's no spirit world. The second one is accommodation, where the spirit world is accepted and is incorporated into the church, into rituals and so on in various degrees. I won't go much into that now. And the third one is the one that I've already described, one of confrontation, where the presence of the spirit world is acknowledged, but it is demonized. So an important part of Christian rituals consists of getting rid of Satan and demons. In the words of Birgit Meyer, she's an anthropologist as well, of course, this is what she calls translating the devil, where old ideas are accepted but invested with biblical meanings and then opposed in a spiritual war. This response we could characterize by both continuity and discontinuity, and is much more difficult to neatly place on the spectrum. So I'm going to briefly take these 3 main aspects of the spirit world, ancestors, witchcraft, and misfortune, and illustrate how South African Pentecostals deal with them. So the first area of the spirit world is that of the ancestors. The ancestors and ancestor veneration play a central role in all forms of sub-Saharan African religions, particularly in Southern Africa, manifesting in the interpretation of dreams, funeral practices, church exorcisms, deliverance ministries, as some churches call it, and naming ceremonies. They're the guardians, the ancestors are the guardians and protectors of African societies. The influence of the departed dead on social relations continues to be a factor in the African understanding of the spirit world. The ancestors are the most prominent aspect of African religious practices. For most urban Africans, ancestors are a reality to be given due acknowledgement. Pentecostals have some ambiguity in how they regard this phenomenon, and their conflicting views on ancestors are explored in the book in more detail. Their ambiguity can be explained by reference to the continuity-discontinuity theme. Pentecostals attempt to reconcile Western missionary-influenced demonization of ancestors with their traditional familial respect. How this is done is the subject of the interviews and the later analysis. The tension between the continuation of ancient beliefs and practices and the rejection or the discontinuation of them as manifestations of evil spirits is an important part of this discussion. When considering African Pentecostalism, it's important to understand that there are two religious contexts interacting with and influencing each other, that of Christianity and that of African religiosity. These two contexts are not necessarily in conflict, rather, we should see them in dialogue with each other. It might be that there's no clearer illustration of this dialogue than in African Pentecostalism. Members of Pentecostal churches were generally unqualified in rejecting ancestor commemoration. In this respect, they were the most confrontational of all the church members researched in the early research with regard to these key traditional beliefs. The ancestors are believed to exist, but Christians do not need to do anything about them or to make any ritual killings for them because they have no power over Christians. Nearly all the Pentecostals said that they did not commemorate the ancestors and did not consult diviners, the traditional healers. This indicates that these churches have rejected traditional practices and display a radical break with what are regarded as pagan practices. Pentecostals were quite sure that a person who is saved does not do these things. They represent the old life out of which everything has become new. From there, of course, you get the term being born again. In this respect, there's a noticeable contrast to other church members in Soshanguve. Pentecostals are more forthright in their rejection of those practices that they see as incompatible with their Christianity than the members of other church types are. In actual practice, the rejection of ancestors is ambivalent, as it's very difficult for anyone to be completely disentangled from social practices connected with the ancestors without separating oneself from being an African. But many African Pentecostals have done just that. There seems to be ambiguity, as I mentioned, in the attitudes of African Pentecostals to the ancestors. In one interview, the ancestors were rejected. This practice belonged to the old life, to the darkness, to a person without Jesus Christ. But at the same time, the ancestors were acknowledged as a reality. This particular interview seemed to show that the ancestors and the devil were the same thing, for people needed to be set free from the darkness so that they would no longer obey the instructions of the devil. Another Pentecostal church member said that to have communication with the ancestors was against the Bible, which taught that there was to be no contact between the living and the dead. A Pentecostal woman said that before she became a Christian, she would go to the graveyard whenever things were not going well. But now, since she was saved, she had nothing more to do with the ancestors. I'm going to have to cut some of this, I can see by my watch. So I'm going to pass on to, the point is that whatever were formerly perceived as ancestors in the past are still seen as real, but are confronted instead of accommodated, because they have, in the views of these respondents, become evil spirits. So witchcraft is the second area. How do people, Pentecostals, deal with this ever-present witchcraft? The spirit world and witchcraft are closely linked to concepts of power and its manipulation by religious specialists. Some people, especially the religious specialists or diviners, have more power than others. This power may reside in medicines, words, names, charms, amulets, beads, and other inanimate objects. Possessing this power enables people to do extraordinary or supernatural things. It may help prevent evil from happening. Because of these benefits, people want to increase their power. The greatest disasters possible follow the lessening of power. Illnesses, suffering, disappointments, exhaustion, injustice, oppression, any kind of failure or misfortune are all regarded as a loss of power. So everything possible is done to avoid its loss and to promote its increase. So witchcraft comes in here because besides the so-called good diviners, the ones who help people to get better, there's also the unseen evil and antisocial power of witches, of sorcerers, or the wizards who use witchcraft to achieve their dastardly deeds. Witches deliberately use medicine, which in Southern Africa is called muti, against their victims, and they are seen as the personification of evil in a community. The sorcerer has too much power, which is selfishly used to harm others. There's other discussion here about the primary motivation behind witchcraft is jealousy, and jealousy is something that is rife in societies. I haven't got time to go into that too much here, but just to say, that Pentecostals in our research spoke of their problems at work, of losing employment, and of the witchcraft inflicted on them by a jealous colleague or an employer. One focus group participant said that this form of witchcraft was rife in places of employment in the city. He said, "You have to be careful eating a cake at work because someone could add muti to it to do you harm." One participant told of her son who wanted to marry his girlfriend, but the marriage was not approved by her parents because they wanted her to marry a richer man. So they bewitched the son so that he became insane and began talking to himself. In the same group, a man spoke of his relative who was having an extramarital affair and was bewitched by his mistress's family so that he spent all his money on them instead of supporting his own family. So all the time, these examples are referring to witchcraft. He came for prayer and demons came out of him with manifestations. So there are very few people who do not believe in evil spirits amongst the Christian population. So because witchcraft is a manipulation of power for the detriment of others, there is a link in people's minds between witchcraft and all forms of affliction. Many people believe that some sickness is caused by witchcraft. Some interviewees thought that a bewitched person would become insane, as mental illness is commonly thought to be the result of witchcraft. The question is not usually what a person is suffering from, but what, and particularly who, caused it. And then the final area linked to these ideas of power in the spirit world is of bad luck or misfortune. The question, where does bad luck come from, produced some interesting answers in our interviews and focus groups. Traditionally, people believed that misfortune came when there were bad relationships in a family or community. Of course, this included not respecting traditional practices, especially those regarding the ancestors. One woman immediately answered that the ancestors sent misfortune when they were not obeyed. Bad luck happened automatically if the bonds between people were disregarded. This, one man observed, is a continent-wide trend. People all over Africa believe that misfortune is rampant because this is what has always been believed, he said. One woman said that bad luck came as a test from Satan because since she had become a Christian, she was now having trouble caused by the ancestors who did not want to be neglected. There is often a link between misfortune and witchcraft, thus also linking bad luck with jealousy. One woman said clearly, bad luck comes through jealousy. When someone is jealous, they might hate you and visit a traditional healer to put a curse on you, she said. Another one said that it started with jealousy. Once a person was jealous of someone, they could visit the witch doctor in order to bewitch that person who would then have bad luck. And so on. It went on like that. Most Pentecostals interviewed saw Satan or the devil as the author of evil and misfortune, the personification of everything that went wrong in the lives of Christians. So these two views of evil, well, I've left out something there, so maybe I'll just go to the, I've got a discussion which unfortunately I won't have time to do, but it's quite interesting to see that the whole concept of misfortune and of course the opposite, fortune and prosperity, is part of the African worldview. And this is one of the reasons why the prosperity gospel has flourished in Africa. Prosperity is defined in a different way in African religions than it is, for example, in the American Bible Belt. And it's always been an important sign of the blessing of the Creator God. So when Africans say God is good, God is love, etc., they do not separate God's moral attributes from God's provision. So the question is not whether the prosperity gospel is compatible with African religions, but how it relates to the continuity-discontinuity tension and has been appropriated and transformed in Pentecostalism. So I don't think that the popularity of the teaching in Africa can be simply regarded as a repetition of the American version of the prosperity gospel. It needs to be seen in its context. So in conclusion, very short conclusion, a study of the continuous-discontinuous relationship between Pentecostalism and the African spirit world is absolutely necessary. Pentecostalism has been relevant because it has continued some pre-Christian religious expressions, ideas, and ritual symbols and has transformed them with new meanings. African beliefs and practices have been transformed, so Christianity is presented as an attractive spiritual alternative. Indeed, Christianity as a whole has been both a continuous and discontinuous relationship with other religions for 2 millennia. Most forms of African Christianity have translated the devil by accepting the reality of the spirit world, but denying its power and influence, confronting it, thereby giving it new meaning. This ability to keep continuity and discontinuity in tension is one of the most significant reasons for the growth of Pentecostalism, not only in the sub-Sahara, but in many other regions worldwide. I could just add at the end that if any of you would like to have a copy of this paper, I could certainly make that available to you.
Thank you so much, Allan, for this great paper.